Hey everybody, this is Mr. Baker. Hope you're doing great. This is going to be a discussion today of basically the events that go from the end of Manifest Destiny through basically the election of Abraham Lincoln and eventually secession. So we're going to look at a pretty broad spectrum of time today, relatively speaking. And the big question that we want to think about is, how did the progression of events from the Compromise of 1850 through Abraham Lincoln's election as president in 1860, so again, about a 10-year period of time, lead to further sectional division and ultimately secession by southern states? Okay, so we're about at the time where we're seeing the Civil War unfold. And so we want to think about, how do we really kind of make sense of this? Well, in order to do that, let's think back to where we left off. So we were talking last time about the importance of manifest destiny. And a lot of us guys, if you go back and you think about the basic nuts and bolts definition of manifest destiny, what is a very good, concise definition of manifest destiny? It was kind of like this movement that was inspired by some people that were religious, etc., political as well, to basically move from coast to coast. In other words, from east to west, from the Atlantic part of the country all the way to the Pacific coast, basically for a variety of different reasons, but it involved territorial expansion. Okay, so did everybody support Manifest Destiny? No, they did not. All right, especially those that were against the idea of war, which is what we eventually had with Mexico, keep in mind. So you don't have to memorize these dates, but keep in mind, guys, the importance of context. So we're building up events that are setting the stage for eventually a lot of these southern states to say, we don't think that we're really going to fit in well with the country's goals moving forward. And as a result, they choose to leave. Okay, or chose to leave, excuse me. Okay, so just a couple of things for us to just keep in the back of our minds. You see this pretty good sized amount of change. We'll look at on the next slide as well. And guys, what happens? How does this territorial acquisition have both positive and negative consequences? Well, the positives are going to be things like we have more land, we have resources. You're going to see a lot of people, guys, aspiring to become very rich because of the gold rush, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, you're going to see new industries that'll be popping up, the cattle industry, or what we also call the ranching industry, et cetera. Okay, but the downside with that, of course, is going to be when you add new territory in a time period where slavery is technically legal in other states. The big question is going to be, what is basically the outcome there? And the answer is, you're going to have those that want to expand it. Now, keep in mind, okay, guys, if you look at this picture here, you've got a lot of people that are obviously eyeing the idea of expansion. So take a moment, you can pause the screen if you want to here, but ask yourself the question, what do you think this image indicates about manifest destiny? Okay, and I would say that for the most part, those people, like, for example, the titles you can see, Daniel Boone. When we think of Boone, we think of a kind of like a pioneer, somebody who kind of paved the way for settlements of areas that were not developed at that point as much. Okay, and so therefore, this person, I think it's safe to say, is definitely looking at the potential of moving westward. Remember, Kentucky was considered to be, at a certain period of time, one of the first truly Western states. Okay. So anyway, we're moving certainly beyond the borders. And then this one comes around a little bit later. And I think a lot of you guys have seen this. Now, what is going on in this picture that also shows us a commitment to westward movement? Okay. And I want you to take a note, guys, mentally, of when this picture was created. All right. Or this painting. It's 1872. So we have not even gotten into the post-Civil War period, because we just literally got to the area that's really before the Civil War. But guys, if you think about it, what is going on in that picture that gives us an idea, pardon me, about the idea of manifest destiny, movement, westward development, etc.? There's a lot of stuff. People moving forward in Conestoga wagons. You can see, obviously, the further development of what eventually is the Transcontinental Railroad. You see telegraph lines. You see this figure here, When we see a figure like that, it usually indicates something along the lines of an angel, something that we relate heavily to religion, particularly Christian religion in this case. Okay. But we also notice some things that are not going to have as good of an impact. For example, the Native Americans are going to be, in some cases, displaced and eventually forced onto more permanent reservations. We see eventually the destruction of the bison here that was a big part of the Plains Native Americans' way of life. Okay. And then you also notice even here these eventually what they call homesteaders. Okay. And a lot of you might be like, well, Mr. Baker, this over there, that kind of makes me think of things like canals and also riverways, etc. Okay, so what we notice, guys, is that this image is definitely, I think, supporting a lot of ways the idea of westward movement. Okay, so how does this impact our political structure? Well, it's a really good question. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. You're welcome to pause it, guys, if you need to. But the idea, guys, of American political parties. Now, if you go back to the 1820s, what's the one impact that Jackson had? He splits the party, right? The Democratic Republicans become the Democrats and the National Republicans. Well, over time, the National Republicans basically make a shift to what is called the Whig Party. Okay, and the Whigs are, if you didn't know this, guys, for those of you that have not really studied in depth the colonial and also the Revolutionary period, that was a group of people that basically identified with a lot of the resistance to like some of the policies of Britain, etc. Okay, and so what you're going to see is that these National Republicans eventually become the Whig Party. In fact, Abraham Lincoln, everybody's heard of him before, right, was actually a Whig. Henry Clay, who was a National Republican and a big hero of Lincoln. We'll see what Lincoln has to say about him here in a second. What's the one thing, guys, that we notice about Henry Clay is that Henry Clay then makes the shift to being a Whig. Okay, but the argument is, guys, is that the Whigs do have a couple of presidents that serve. We won't say a lot about them, but presidents like William Henry Harrison, John Tyler technically was on the Whig platform. Okay, but what we notice, guys, about the Whig Party is that they start to decline in the earlier 1850s. Okay, now keep in mind, what do we mean when we say decline? They basically start to phase themselves out. Okay, but they're not going to be like the Federalist guys in the sense that you have about a one-party rule, or not one-party rule, but one party that really dominates things for about 9 years or so. Okay, you're going to see them replaced eventually with what we call the Republican Party. All right, so we'll come back to that. You also start to see, guys, the interest of third parties. Okay, I have a question for all of you. What usually comes to mind when you think of a third party? Okay, and the other question to ask yourselves, guys, is that do third parties in most cases have a legitimate chance to win an election, right? For president especially, okay? And the answer is that America, guys, if you didn't know this, is really a little bit of political party history here and so forth, is that we have most of the time, with a little bit of an exception, with about a 9-year period, been a bipartisan political party system. That means that we've had two parties that have mostly affected our politics the most. All right. And if you go back to the early days of the Federalist era with Washington, we've already talked about that. You've got the Federalists, you've got the Democratic Republicans. Now, what is the purpose of third parties? There's different schools of thought about that, but one of the bigger schools of thought is that they usually bring attention to an issue that they really want brought to national forefront. Maybe the thought is the other major parties are not addressing an issue quite as much. And as a result of that, what do they need to do? They need to make it a more permanent national issue. Well, take a look at what happens. Okay, you're going to have the know-nothings pop up. Okay, and so basically their party platform is going to center around the idea of nativism. All right, now I think this is in your weekly vocab, but nativism, guys, in a sense, is basically a policy where you're wanting the federal government to basically favor or promote the interest of natural-born Americans over, you guessed it, the immigrant population. Okay. Now, nativism is going to go kind of like in waves. Okay, so you'll see nativism in the 1840s, 1830s. It'll kind of take a little bit of a backseat, and then it kind of resurfaces in the latter 1800s, and then also the 1900s, etc. Now, think about it like this: what group or groups of immigrants are we seeing the largest immigration from in the 1840s? And it's two groups that actually come from Northern Europe. One is going to be Ireland. The other one is going to be Germany. Okay. And this is a big deal because the thing, guys, with this is that a lot of these Irish were discriminated against partly because they were Roman Catholic. You know, if you were somebody that believed in temperance, by the way, the movement to kind of eliminate alcohol or certainly reduce its use, then you saw them as people, at least some did, that, you know, were heavily reliant on things like wine, drinking. That wasn't the only argument against them, but it was one of the bigger ones that came out from the standpoint of temperance. And guys, what you noticed is that these policies are going to start to try to restrict, you know, things like movement around, etc. Okay, so nativism becomes big. And oh yeah, by the way, a lot of you guys might be wondering, Mr. Baker, why were they called the Know Nothings? Well, according to what you read, they really did not want to talk about any other issue other than nativism and immigration. And so a lot of times, if they were asked a question about something else, like maybe it was slavery or maybe it was a tariff issue or something like that, they would usually say, I know nothing. Okay. So they wanted to concentrate the issue with that. Okay. So what do we notice? We notice the rise again of, I'm going to stop hopscotch guys down to 4. We notice with all this land that we gain control over with the Louisiana Territory and other territories that are now becoming states or wanting to, okay, what do we notice? We see there's a big emphasis on trying to restrict the spread of slavery. Okay. And so that's going to be the rise of what we call the Free Soil Party. Okay. So they're not advocating necessarily to get rid of slavery with where it exists. Okay. I think that's a big thing for us to make sure that we're aware of. Although I will tell you this, shortly after America basically gets this territory from Mexico with the Mexican War, we have a gentleman by the name of David Wilmot. David Wilmot, if you didn't know this, guys, was actually a congressman from the great state of Pennsylvania. He created what was called the Wilmot Proviso. Now, a lot of you are thinking, well, Mr. Baker, what in the world are you talking about? A proviso, it basically says something. Well, guess what it said? It basically said, and it does not actually get passed through Congress, but he tried to get it passed. It basically said that any of the territory that we would actually obtain from Mexico could not be open to slavery. Okay. And so what we notice, guys, about the development of these free soilers in the later 1840s is that a lot of them are going to be very much in favor of entering new states like California eventually as a free state. Okay. Now, what happens? Well, eventually we're going to have the Whigs that go in their own direction and die out. Many of the Whigs are actually going to support a more anti-slavery or at least a limiting the expansion of slavery platform. 1854, this might be worth noting, we see the formal establishment of the Republican Party. Okay? So, it is not possible, guys, moving forward for us to ignore the slavery question. Now, I'm not insinuating, guys, that we've done that, but we already talked briefly about the Missouri Compromise about 30 years before this. Okay, it's even going to get a lot more, shall we say, dicey. Okay, so by 1854, guys, you can make a really strong argument that this Republican Party, some at least, are forming this party in opposition to expanding slave power of the South. Now, keep in mind, what do we mean when we say slave power? A lot of people, guys, when they think of the South, if you're not careful, it's very easy to come to this conclusion that, yeah, a lot of the Southerners were slave owners. Guys, you got to remember a very small class of people that we call, you know, the Southern aristocratic class, some people would call them, folks like John C. Calhoun, etc. They're a very, very small portion of the Southern population. But they're also a very influential portion because they control a lot of the politics. They control a lot of the economic strength. Okay. And so therefore, as you can imagine, that's going to be who primarily is driving those kinds of sets of interests. So I want you to think, guys, about this essential question. What conclusion can you draw about the issues impacting political parties leading into the 1850s and 1860s? And I think we can figure this out, that we've got issues popping up. We've got the immigration concern, but we also have the idea of slavery becoming an ever more divisive issue. Okay? And so what do we notice? Well, we accumulate all this land. Guys, the Mexican cession, huge. Huge. I mean, there's a lot of land there. There's a lot of current states that come out of that territory. All right? California, Nevada, etc. Okay? And so what do we start to see? People are moving out there. They hear about it. It's a cool place to go. They've got gold. At least that's what a lot of people assumed. Most people did not get as rich or accumulate the wealth that they expected. But nonetheless, California by the later 1840s, 1849 to be exact, what do? They have enough population to justify statehood, which basically means they have the right to create a constitution. And they also have the right to petition or apply for statehood, which is kind of like applying for a college. Okay. You apply, they accept you, or they don't. Okay. California wants to become a free state. Now, think about why this is important. Okay. It's important because California, guys, has a big decision, the U.S. has a big decision to make. It's very similar to the Missouri Compromise of 1820. You want to keep that balance of states. Okay. And guys, remember, we've got that 36°30 line that the Missouri Compromise created that stated specifically that you cannot have slavery above that line except for the state of Missouri. Well, you got to remember, all that territory that we talked about, California, etc., is outside of that original territory that applied to, right? So does the Missouri Compromise still apply? We're going to see what the court has to say about that in principle here in just a couple of minutes, okay? And so what happens? Well, we still have Henry Clay. Henry Clay is still alive. He lives until about 1852. And so he's still the great compromiser that he was back in the days of the Missouri Compromise. And so he puts together what eventually became known as the Compromise of 1850. Now, something, guys, to keep in mind is that this is a series of about 4 major parts. So they're separate, but they eventually get grouped into what eventually was the Compromise of 1850. Okay? Think about what Clay is trying to do. Clay is basically trying to do very similar to what he did in 1820, which is keep the Union intact. Okay? Which is what Lincoln really admired about him. We're going to try to look at a quote here in a second if we have time. Okay? And so what happens? Well, eventually they're going to put forth California will in fact be entered as a free state. Right? If you need to pause your screen, guys, for a moment to actually get this down, you're welcome to. Now, fugitive slave law. That is something, in my opinion, worth starring. Here's the reason being. There's a strong case to be made, guys, that without this in this compromise, the South will not agree to it. Okay? And a lot of you guys are like, well, Mr. Baker, what in the world is a fugitive slave law? Well, there's a fugitive slave clause in the original Constitution, right? That basically says that it protects, it doesn't mention slavery by name, but it basically is making the argument, guys, that if let's say a slave or a person that were, owned by someone else or whatever was actually able to escape, that actually it was legal for, somebody living in a free state to have to cooperate to return him or her to where they were from, right? Whether that was Delaware, South Carolina, even, guys, keep in mind, even northern states prior to then did in fact allow slavery, but they start to phase it out through emancipation laws. Okay. So what this does is this adds some bark to the bite of the original Constitution. And so there's going to be a lot more emphasis, guys, on holding people more accountable. Now, as you can imagine, we've already talked about the abolitionist movement. This is not going to be popular with abolitionists. Okay. And so you're going to have a lot of people, and especially strong northern states, Massachusetts, New York, places like that, that are going to be like, you know what? No, we're not going to do this, even if it says that we have to. And so that Underground Railroad that you almost always hear about, right? Harriet Tubman, et cetera. Okay. They're going to be like turning their cheek when you see these people that are trying to escape to eventually, even Canada, right? Which is, of course, a different country, right? Or a different area. Okay. And so is it enforceable is the question. If you have people like William Lloyd Garrison, right, that literally burned a copy of our Constitution because it was, in his view, a pro-slavery document. Okay. Even though it doesn't mention it explicitly by name, he makes the argument that it does protect it. Those people, guys, are not going to support it. What about the other two things? Well, it does end the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Now, I emphasize the word trade here because does it say it ends slavery? It does not. Okay. But it does end the trade within the capital city. Okay. But the most important thing, guys, beyond that is that they make the argument that you can use popular sovereignty. All right. That's also in your notes, guys, but we'll define it more in a second. But basically, there's two territories, New Mexico and Utah. They're going to say to the people, right? Popular sovereignty was a popular idea. It's not new. It's in the Constitution as far as the principle. The principle, guys, of popular sovereignty is that you're basically making it to where people have the right to vote on certain things. Well, in the case of popular sovereignty with this, what do you think they're going to be voting on? Right. The status of a territory. Do they want it to be free or do they want it to be a slave state? Okay. And think about it like this. Is that a good thing? I mean, you could say, well, it's democratic. People vote. People have, rights to basically be involved. Okay. But this, guys, is a hornet's nest waiting to happen. All right. You've already had slave uprisings in the earlier 1820s and the earlier 1830s before then as well. Okay. So we already see this developing. Okay. And so what does the compromise basically show about Lincoln admiring Henry Clay? Well, let me show you this. It's actually the same slide, but the quote here is different. All right. So Henry Clay, as I said before, died in the year 1852. He and Lincoln were basically from the same state of Kentucky. Although keep in mind, Lincoln hung his hat more of his life in Illinois. Okay. And so he was a big admirer of Clay. And so when Clay died, right, he's going to have all these people giving him eulogies, which are kind of like praises, right? Giving positive attention. Well, guys, look at what his here. This is not the whole eulogy. If you ever want to read it, this is the document name. You can actually go and Google it. It's a really interesting read. But guys, look at what he says. I think this is a really impactful statement about Clay. He says, I recognize his, talking about Clay, voice, speaking as it every spoke for the Union, the Constitution, and the freedom of mankind. What is he saying here? Everything with Clay. Now, Clay was a slaveholder. All right. So, obviously there's quite a bit of critical attention brought to that. Okay. He was from a slave state. Keep in mind, guys, Kentucky was a slave state. Never left the Union, but it was nonetheless a slave state. Okay. But what is he getting at? He's giving him a lot of attention, guys, for being a very strong advocate of Union first. Okay. And guys, if you take a look at Lincoln, which we will the week after next and the next week, so for about a week and a half, we'll look at the Civil War in some depth. Guys, Lincoln is very, very clear. Even when he runs on a Republican platform that does oppose the expansion of slavery, not getting rid of it where it exists, per se. Okay. He basically makes it very clear. It's the Union, period. right? So there's that big debate that comes up that a lot of you guys are familiar with. What was the big cause of the Civil War? What was, and we always talk about slavery for good reason. But guys, Lincoln, very committed to Union. On multiple occasions, not to beat a dead horse with Lincoln right now. We'll come back to him here in a moment. But guys, keep in mind, Lincoln is very clear that this war is about Union first. Now, during the war, as we'll look at later, he does redefine his goals on that. But it's something to keep in mind. Okay? So just to give you a little bit of context, guys, for geography, this is the two territories, Utah and New Mexico, that actually will be able to make a decision. They can vote on what they want to do with their eventual statehood. All right, at least that's what the compromise says. Okay? And so things get a little bit better. Well, maybe better is not the right word, but things are kind of a little bit more, calm for a few years. And then between 1854 and 1860, 1861, we have what is called a lot of these cause and effects. Now, guys, if I were you, I would pause your screen for a moment. I'm going to pause for just a second, and then when you're done, you'll hear me start talking again. But guys, what you want to ask yourself with this is, how does events that go from the Kansas-Nebraska Act through Lincoln's election continue to lead us down that road of sectional tension? Okay. Now, a lot of you guys have been thinking, hopefully, Mr. Baker, you've mentioned the word sectionalism a couple of times, and we've talked about that a little bit before, but what is that really getting at? It's kind of like this preference, guys, you could say, of you've got different regions of the country looking out after their own personal interests more. So the South is going to be looking after their interests more so with maybe agriculture or even expanding slavery in some people's cases, whereas the North is looking at it more from a manufacturing perspective, right, or different economic perspective. But there's political things there too, social, etc. Now, what we notice, guys, if you take a look at every single one of these events, in some way, shape, or form, there is going to be a connection to the issue of either slavery or something that is impacted by that issue. Okay, so just a couple of things to keep in mind. By the way, Stephen A. Douglas, there is not a misspelling of his last name here. His name is spelled with one S instead of two, like Frederick, so do not get that mistaken. But guys, he's going to be an up-and-coming major figure in the Senate. Okay, and so what he does, he's from the same state as Abraham Lincoln. We'll look at that more in a moment. Lincoln goes out and actually debates him for the Senate seat a few years later. Douglas is actually going to come out on top there, but we'll look at that more in a second. But guys, in 1854, okay, Douglas basically comes up with this plan, and it's called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, guys, if you go back, I'll go back to our map for a second. Okay, you'll notice that eventually the Louisiana Purchase was a lot of states. Well, at this point in time, there's a pretty big piece of land that we call Kansas-Nebraska that has not really been as organized and developed. And so the argument, guys, on the part of Douglas is, why not do that? Why not bring new states in the Union? Okay, what he does with this act is he makes it clear. He said, we're going to open up this for the people to be able to decide. Okay, the people can decide. The voters, in other words, the people that are eligible to vote, all right, are basically going to be able to vote. So that's going to be the use of popular sovereignty. Is that a good idea? Well, the answer is it's kind of debatable. But Bleeding Kansas happens, as you can see, about 2 years later. Now, I call this, guys, the dress rehearsal to the Civil War. So the quick version of this, guys, is that people start to flock to Kansas. And if you go back to the map here, guys, what slave state is right next to Kansas? Missouri. All right, so you've got Missourians that are called border ruffians, by the way, that's a nickname for them, that are actually coming into Kansas. They're bringing slaves with them. Ergo, they have an agenda. They want to make this a slave territory and eventually a slave state. Okay, and then you've got people that are trying to balance out the interest of those that are anti-slavery. And so you've got this group that's coming from New England that is called the New England Aid Society, I think it was called. And guys, what happens is that Kansas goes through basically two different capitals are established, two different constitutions are going to be created. One is going to be a slave constitution. The other one's going to be anti-slavery. And so what happens? You've got this big mess. And so you literally have a battle, basically, that we eventually call Bleeding Kansas. Now, John Brown, let me show you this picture, guys, is going to be one of the leading figures, who, by the way, is a pretty radical abolitionist. All right, we'll talk about him more in a second. Okay. And guys, what you notice, if you take a look here, you'll notice in this picture, you've got the American flag over here. You've got the Confederate flag over here. Okay. This is a little bit of a blown up picture, so you don't see all the fine details. But guys, what is that really illustrating about John Brown? John Brown was heavily involved in this massacre at a place called Pottawatomie Creek. Okay. Now, he eventually, as you can see here, guys, is going to resurface about 3 years later in Harper's Ferry. All right, and we'll talk about his role with that in a second. So, guys, it's very, very important to keep in mind that this violence in Kansas, which is exactly what it was, is a perfect example how that's going to happen. Kansas, I don't think, became an actual state until I want to say it was like 1861. Okay? But something to keep in the back of your minds. Then we have the same year another event that's called the Sumner-Brooks or the Brooks-Sumner incident. This is in Congress, within the government itself. So the story with this, guys, is that you had a gentleman by the name of Charles Sumner. All right, I'm going to show you the political cartoon on this in a second. Charles Sumner was from Massachusetts. He was more anti-slavery. Preston Brooks was actually from South Carolina. Okay. He had a relative of his from South Carolina. I want to say his name was Andrew Butler. And the one thing, guys, that you'll notice with South Carolinians, you've already seen a little bit of this with the famous nullification crisis with Jackson, is that South Carolina is very quick to take up suit when they think that their rights and their people have been stepped upon. Makes good reason why. What happens is Brooks basically takes very strong issue with Sumner, basically speaking bad of not just his family, but the South particularly. And evidently, guys, Sumner was sitting at a desk. Brooks takes a cane or something along those lines and proceeds to literally beat Charles Sumner to a bloody pulp, pretty much. Now, to give you an example how bad of a beating this was, Sumner is still in Congress post-Civil War. And I read a story, guys, one time that said that Charles Sumner, this attack was so brutal on him that he had lifelong migraine headaches, really bad headache, whatever word you want to use for it. Guys, he never, to my knowledge, truly forgave Brooks for the beating, but also the association with the South. And so during Reconstruction, post-Civil War, guys, he's going to be one of the leading radical Republicans that are very opposed to bringing back the South into the Union without certain very strong concessions. There's the political cartoon. So think about that. What is that telling us? Is that more pro-South or pro-North? It's something to keep in mind. Okay. We're almost done. Now, the Dred Scott case, I'm going to play a video for you if we have time at the end. It's about 5 minutes. It's going to this court case, guys, might very well be the most significant court case in the history of the court up to this period of time, and possibly even one of the top ones in the history of the court. I know that's saying a lot, given that we've had a lot of these cases that come up, Brown, etc. Okay, but guys, Dred Scott. What do you all know about Dred Scott, if anything? Well, he was a slave. Okay. He was brought by his owning family to, I want to say it was the Wisconsin Territory, Northern Territory. But guys, if you don't know much about the Northwest Territory, it was made very clear in the Northwest Ordinance that it is not to be open to slavery. No slavery is allowed. Now, as far as it being a slave state. Now, this creates a little bit of a can of worms, actually quite a bit of one. Okay. Because what happens is that Dred Scott lives in that state for a few years or whatever. And then the question is he free because he's actually lived in a free state? Okay. So he's going to make the argument, guys, that this should make him a free man. Look at the outcome of the case. So Roger Taney, I'm going to show you a picture of him here in just a second, okay, who's the Chief Justice, okay? If you've ever heard the quote that came out of this case, like white men, there's no rights of the black men that the white men basically have to respect, et cetera, that is actually close to a verbatim statement from this court case, guys. This court case really does not provide a strong showing for protecting rights, especially of African Americans in this respect. But look what it says: slaves are property, not citizens. So therefore, they're automatically saying, guys, that that African Americans are not citizens. That will not be firmly defined until the 14th Amendment, which, by the way, is 1868, 3 years after the Civil War. Okay? If you're not a citizen, why is that a problem? You can't not only vote, but you also cannot write. You can't sue in court. Okay? At least according to the court, you could say. Property must be protected in all states. Ergo, they're making it clear that slaves are property. Okay? And then last but not least, slavery cannot be restricted in its expansion. So let's go back to our map. So guys, remember, before we actually when we talked about the Missouri Compromise, there was this line created. Now keep in mind, none of this territory over there is U.S. territory yet. All of this territory there was to be restricted to slavery. Essentially, what is this saying? It's saying that the Missouri Compromise was never constitutional. Okay, so the question is that a victory for the North or South? In my mind, it's definitely a victory for the South, for the interests of people that own slaves and want to extend it. Okay, guys, to give you an idea a little bit, this is Roger Taney. That is how you correctly say his last name. Okay, so you'll notice that he is probably one of the more well-known Chief Justices. Of course, this is Dred Scott. Guys, if you read commentaries on the Dred Scott case, which I've read quite a few of them, almost everyone that I've read would say that the Dred Scott case is the worst, outcome in the history of the U.S. Supreme Court. And I think that we can look at that outcome and definitely see why a lot of constitutional scholars would come to that conclusion. Okay. Now, as you can imagine, this is a big political issue. Whenever you have people running for office, they're going to be talking about the outcome of this case. That's exactly what's going to happen when we have the Senate election for the state of Illinois the next year in 1858. Lincoln, for good reason, guys, by this time, he is a Republican. Republicans, keep in mind, were created in the 1854 year. All right. And of course, the argument, guys, that was a response to Southern slave power. Lincoln makes it very clear. He has about 7 debates with Stephen A. Douglas. All the debates you don't have to worry too much about. They do reaffirm that Douglas was, in fact, in favor of popular sovereignty quite a bit, okay, with giving territories the right to choose. What do we notice? Lincoln does not win this election over Douglas. But what does happen, which I think is interesting, is that Lincoln is actually going to get a lot of attention. So even though he doesn't win, he is going to be in good shape to run for president, which, by the way, when's the next presidential election? It's the year 1860. Okay? But between then, we have the famous John Brown's raid. Okay? John Brown, again, resurfaces. Guys, he saw himself as a martyr for the cause of abolition. Okay? We'll talk about what that means in a second. So he basically takes control of this federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, which at the time was in Virginia, before Virginia and West Virginia actually split. Okay. And he has a goal. His goal is to, guys, create the slave uprising, arm slaves. Several of his kids, I think 2 of his sons or something like that, were involved. Okay. And what happens? Well, this is a federal arsenal. What does that mean? It means that weapons are held there. James Buchanan is in office when this happens. Okay. Who, by the way, is the predecessor to Lincoln. Okay. And what does Buchanan do? He sends in one of the more famous generals that comes about after the Civil War gets started, in Robert E. Lee. Lee is given one basic task, for the most part: go in and apprehend John Brown. And he did. So they arrest him. They take him into custody. They tried him, basically, for treason. And don't even know the outcome. He was found guilty, and he was sentenced to death. He did an interview before he was actually executed, guys, by a gentleman, Clement Landingham, I believe his name was. It was a congressman from Ohio. And guys, it's an interesting story if you want to Google it. But he had no remorse. Thought he was a martyr. Basically, I'm going to die for the cause. Martyr. The term martyr is usually connected to some kind of religious principle of some sort. Guys, he really believed that he was, from what I've read anyway, that he was doing God's work with overcoming slavery. And the end result of that is he takes his punishment. A few years ago, I don't know if any of you have ever been to Washington, D.C., but if you ever get a chance to go to the U.S. History Museum, the Smithsonian, ever so often they'll have like little actors, and not little, but little historical actors come in. And when I went there, they actually had a demonstration of a gentleman that was an expert on John Brown. And he actually was representing him as the character. And so you, the audience, had to basically pretend that you were the jury. And, you know, there were 2 sides, like his side and, of course, the other side. And it was really fascinating to hear, you know, this guy just literally pleading, hey, you know, this was an institution that was immoral by God's standards. I was doing what God wanted. And as a result, I'm taking my punishment. And guys, he was executed. Okay. So obviously a big deal. Last but not least, the election of 1860. Now, what do we notice about the election of 1860? There's 4 candidates. And all of them are going to get some degree of support. We're going to look at that on our next slide. So guys, let me ask you this. So how often in modern day politics do you see 4 candidates that have a degree of chance to probably really not just get some popular votes, but also some electoral college votes? I can't think of really a lot of elections in my lifetime that have actually had that possibility. Maybe the 1992 election with Ross Perot, okay, which, by the way, he got about 19% of the popular vote, but no electoral college votes. Side story there. This election, some of the names you're like, well, I've heard of Lincoln, but I've not heard of John C. Breckinridge. I've not heard of John Bell. Okay. So what's the one thing that happens in the Democratic Party? It splits. Okay. So Breckinridge is going to represent the Southern faction of the Democratic Party. And as you can see here, Stephen A. Douglas, kind of a funky hairdo there, guys, is actually going to represent the Northern Democrats. So their party split. Usually when that happens, that is not going to bode well for the party. And then, oh yeah, by the way, you've got John Bell. He was from Tennessee. Just one quick thing about the Constitutional Union Party. They were not in favor of getting rid of slavery, but they were in favor of applying the Constitution the way that it currently stated. At least that's the common phrase that you see come out of their platform. Okay. So all these different groups have a different platform. Lincoln, guys, again, making it very clear, he is not saying we're going to get rid of slavery. He is advocating, at least the party's position is that we're going to basically not advocate for expanding it. Okay. So one of the common phrases that comes out is that you leave it alone where it exists, but you don't basically advocate for spreading it across the rest of the territories. What's the outcome? Well, take a look. Every candidate, as I said before, got electoral votes. Now, you don't have to memorize these, but guys, what do you notice about the Electoral College? That's what really drove the election outcome. You see a lot of red in one region, the North and also the Old Northwest. Today we call that the Midwest, and also Oregon and California. Okay. But what do we notice with the popular vote? Lincoln only got 2/5 of it. Okay. Now, a lot of you guys might be wondering, why is that a big deal? Well, first of all, you don't have to win the popular vote to win the presidential election, right? We've seen that several times in the last 20 to 30 years, okay, amongst other elections. But the problem with this, guys, is that Lincoln, the Republican Party was not even on the ballot for most of these states that you actually see in the green, and even the ones that you see in the yellow, okay? That says something about the way that the South is going to see Lincoln and the Republican Party as a major threat. They're also going to make the argument, guys, that the Republican Party is a regional party. What does that mean? Right. That it basically represents one part of the nation, and it's not going to reflect, okay, that of the rest of the country. When you come to the conclusion, guys, that that might be true, what are we going to see next, which we'll pick up on with our next session? South Carolina, within a month of Lincoln's election, guys, in December of 1860, South Carolina became the first state to actually lead the Union. When Lincoln is inaugurated March 4th of 1861, which, by the way, we'll look at a couple of things with his inaugural address next time, guess how many states have left the Union? 7. 7 states. My home state in North Carolina, at least the one that I would call home now, where I hang my hat, North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and also Arkansas are not going to be the original 7, but they'll eventually join after the famous attack on Fort Sumter. Okay. Guys, I hope this has been a good session for you. All right. I'm going to actually show you really quick the Dred Scott video. And as always, I hope that y'all have had a great session. And I will see you next time after we watch the video. Bye-bye.
My great-great-grandfather was born on a plantation in Southampton, Virginia. He was born to the Blow family. They eventually moved to St. Louis. At this point, they had debts, and they had to sell something to cure those debts. My great-great-grandfather was purchased by an army surgeon.
The slave is taken into the Wisconsin Territory, in what is now Minnesota.
And he met and married a young lady. Slaves were prohibited actually to marry. So it's pretty special that they actually had a wedding. Brought back to St. Louis with his family. At that point, he had something unique. Missouri had a law that said once free, always free.
And Wisconsin Territory is free soil, no slavery.
If a slaveholder were to take a slave and live in the North, then that slave would be liberated.
They were no longer a slave.
But their owner refuses to free them. And in 1846, the slaves enter this courtroom to seek their freedom.
At first it was just about their family, but ultimately it was about a nation. And my ancestor was Dred Scott.
A jury of 12 white men set Dred and Harriet Scott free.
It was a wonderful day, but it was short-lived.
Scott's owner appeals the verdict.
And then the Supreme Court of Missouri changed the precedent of Missouri to say, it didn't free him, and that's when he brought his federal action.
Dred Scott's case lands in the U.S. Supreme Court. The court was stacked against Scott. Of the 9 justices, 5 were from slave states, and a 6th from Pennsylvania also favored slavery. The justices voted 7-2 against Scott, and they did something the framers never imagined. They invented a constitutional right to own slaves.
Some of the worst jurisprudence by our United States.
That was the classic example of the Supreme Court taking upon itself to do what it thought was right and not adhere to the text of the Constitution as it was written.
In his decision, Chief Justice Taney writes,
Negroes have been regarded as beings of inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, and the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit.
What Dred Scott did was to say, yes, they said all men are created equal, but they didn't mean it.
In terms of how it feels now as I'm saying this to you, it angers me. How can one man tell another man that he's benefiting me by enslaving me?
I can't imagine that anything could be worse.
And that blacks could never be citizens for as long as they lived in America.
Because you cannot possibly be, under any circumstances, a citizen of the United States if you're black and you're descended from slaves.
Taney thought he was going to resolve the slavery controversy forever by basically saying, stop arguing about this question, it's settled. But he was wrong. You don't settle a controversy like that simply by saying, I'm right, you're wrong.
Within 3 months of the Dred Scott decision, they did get their freedom. And they did not get it through the courts, but they got it from the hand of the children of their original owners. Dred and Harriet were simple people. The fact that they were born in slavery did not deny them their humanity, nor any human desires as anyone else would have. Their greatest desire was freedom.
The laws still weren't living up to that ideal. In fact, the Dred Scott case was a big step backwards.
Most northern states were content to let the southern states be the southern states, and they weren't prepared to do anything about slavery in the South.
Until the Dred Scott decision.
And that led to a grave perception of a threat. The North finally cared about slavery in a way they hadn't before. And then we know what happened after that.
Between December 1860 and the following June, 11 states secede from the Union and ignite the worst constitutional crisis in American history.
Okay, guys, I'll end y'all with this, with a quick question. So my question, guys, all of you, and I appreciate your time today, is what impact do you think the lingering effects of Dred Scott with saying, there's not citizenship rights, etc., what things are going to happen post-Civil War to kind of make up for, you could argue, with the outcome? All right. Hope y'all had a good session, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you for your time.